you for such a lovely introduction. I've kicked my children off the Wi-Fi, so I'm hoping that this should be uninterrupted. But if at any point there is a technical problem and I'm in full flow, do start gesticulating like mad so that I can pause and correct it. I will talk for around an hour, but I'll try and not make that a sort of tedious drone, because economics is not necessarily the most thrilling of topics at the best of times. I'm going to use lots of props, which I'll wave in front of the camera to try and break up the monotony a bit. But I also want to just reassure those of you of a nervous disposition who find economics rather sort of stressful and possibly indigestible on a Saturday morning, that most of what I'm going to say is not only in my books. There are sort of précis of it and summaries of it in article form and video form through my website. So don't feel under huge pressure to take copious notes and sort of watch back the video and all that kind of thing, because everything I'm going to say you are likely to be able to find in the things I've written. So the two books, you've heard about Capitalism's Toxic Assumptions, scary cover, which I'm going to start with, which is just to do a bit of myth busting about the kind of architecture of capitalism, so that we're all on the same page before we sally forth into the second book, which is more explicitly theological, which is called Buying God, and takes capitalism into a discussion on consumerism, which is the sort of software that runs on capitalism as the hardware, and is really where the most of the danger is really for us as kind of ordinary Christian consumers in the market. As those who've very kindly introduced me have said, I'm very happy for you just to sort of chunter away on the chat if that helps you process what you're hearing, and I can try and kind of duck in and out of whatever comments you're making and weave things through. So if you do have things you're desperate to get off your chest, then do bung them in the chat as we go, and otherwise we will have a pause when we're all making cups of tea to think even more fabulous questions and thoughts at that stage. I'm also very available online, so if you wake up tomorrow morning and think, hang on a minute, Poole is talking nonsense at that juncture, then please get in touch with me on Twitter, Facebook, whatever, LinkedIn, but you can also get my email directly through my website. So if you want to just ping me questions or challenges or anything else, a request for more resources, please do so. Hello from Edinburgh. It's very frosty here this morning. I'm hoping it's not too chilly with you and that you've got blankets. And without any more introductions, I'm just going to sally forth and we'll just try and nail this capitalism business. So I'm going to start with those 7 toxic assumptions. I'm going to start with one which probably needs the longest explanation, and is the thing that we have heard a lot about when we talk about capitalism, which is about free markets and competition. So I have here a nice trophy to remind us all about competition. And I'm just going to talk about why competition is so important to the theory of capitalism. And I should say that I'm basing most of what I say on the kind of received wisdom on the basics of free market capitalism that was codified by people like Adam Smith and Ricardo in the 18th century and has not changed radically since. So there are versions and well springs of different sorts of economy throughout the world and throughout history, but most of what we experience every day in the West is based on these kinds of rules and rubrics and routines, and those are the ones I want to talk about. So capitalism, the competition element within capitalism is this idea that markets work because everyone just gets on with competing. And if you have lots and lots of entities competing away, that drives progress in the market. So if we want any human progress and improvement in any field, what you have to do is apply free market thinking to it in order to encourage competition, in order to encourage progress. And that's certainly been the thinking in public policy behind trying to apply market thinking to the NHS, to education, even within the church, all kinds of areas now where these market disciplines are applied, because as soon as we get competition, the idea is we should get progress. And I want to talk to you about why I think competition is a slightly dodgy concept. And there are 2 reasons I think it's a bit of a dodgy concept, and I think it has some use, but I think it is overused in capitalism, and that's why I want to start with it. So the first reason why I think it isn't the thing you should hang your hat on is because there is a lot of maths that shows that competing all the time is never the optimal strategy. So I don't know how many of you watch movies, but you may remember a movie called A Beautiful Mind, which won Oscars a while ago, which is about a thinker called John Nash, who was also a paranoid schizophrenic, hence the movie, but is responsible for some quite extraordinary mathematical thinking around equilibrium theory. And he showed very beautifully using game theory that actually when you are trying to get better solutions, so that elusive improvement that we're thinking about, actually cooperation is a superior strategy to competition. And that's because competition means that you tend to hoard resources and information and not share it. So what you end up doing is cutting a pie that is a finite amount of if you're thinking about cutting up a birthday cake or cutting up a pie you got from the corner shop. And so you might argue about who gets 30% or 40% or 50% of it, but the pie itself doesn't get any bigger. So if you are trying to drive improvement in society or across markets, actually what you're trying to do is figure out, are there any bigger pies available? And the way you do that, mathematically speaking, is you share information, because then you increase what Nash would call the solution sets available in order to optimize improvement. So the argument from game theory would be that you may want to compete ultimately, but first of all, you should cooperate, because it's only by sharing all the information that you have available that you will get better outcomes. And we know that in everyday life. I think the idea is that in markets, you mustn't let the competition know what's going on, because that's, there's a whole load of stuff in Adam Smith about smoke-filled rooms and price fixing and collusion. And that drives some quite extraordinary behavior, which is based on metaphors of war and, market share and, all of that kind of stuff, which is based on this kind of rather strange thinking, which caps the amount of outcome you can get on the status quo, rather than thinking more creatively about what else might be possible. And it is true that if you are actually in a battle, and it is what they would call in the trade a zero-sum game, so it's I win, you lose, I live, you die, then of course competing is a good idea, because lives are at stake. But if you think about picking the best shampoo or deciding which pasta to get in the supermarket, you're going to be doing that every week for the rest of your life. I mean, it's not a one-off opportunity for a decision. And actually brands and companies are trying to build relationships with consumers and society and all the environments they have in their supply chain across the world. They're going to be repeat opportunities for them to meet and talk and discuss and build relationship. So actually you're not talking about a one-off zero-sum game where you're either going to win or lose. So it's a sort of bad metaphor to think about war and think about finitude and zero-sum games. And it's also very bad maths. And I should say, there's a slightly darker undertone, which is about gender, which is also why competition is a fairly terrible rule to have driving markets. And it's because if you think about sport, and if you think about an awful lot of the ways in which we are brought up and educated in school and further afield, it's virtuous, this idea about competition, and that there's a whole load of kind of reward that comes with it, medals and prizes and OBEs and all that kind of thing. And again, when you start interrogating that, you come up against some physiological reward that when you win, there is an assumption that you feel good about that because you have an adrenaline rush. So we sort of think competition must be a jolly good thing, because generally when we win, we feel fantastic. So, obviously competition and winning particularly are a good thing. But when you start looking at fight or flight responses and physiological responses under stress, it doesn't take you long to realize that our theory of that fight or flight is based on male research. So when they started looking into this, they started with rats, by the way, male rats. And then they thought, well, let's, try a few humans. So they bunged a few humans into the test. And they did have some women at that point, but the data was a bit, the moon and hormones, and it wasn't quite fitting. So they thought, well, let's just chuck all that nonsense and just look at the data that kind of makes sense. So the whole fight or flight thing was based on male physiology. And actually, when some enterprising people led by Shelley Taylor at UCLA in the late 1990s looked into this, and they started trying to make sense of this very muddy data from women, they discovered that there was something different going on, which is when you have all that adrenaline and cortisol produced in your body in response to a perceived threat in your environment, in a male physiology, it interacts with testosterone, but in female physiology, it interacts with oxytocin, which is what we tend to associate with nurture and breastfeeding and all those kinds of things. So in a male physiology, testosterone breeds a particular response, which is incredibly helpful in situations like cavemen times, when we were utterly dependent on the chaps to go and kill saber-toothed tigers and generally rot about and keep us all safe. Because the women were, having periods, children, looking after the old and all those kinds of things and keeping the fires going. And the men were physiologically stronger. So it was a very good division of labor for the chaps to be incredibly physiologically motivated to do zero-sum game all day. The women, meanwhile, were busy kind of keeping the fires burning and chatting away and telling each other stories and keeping everyone quiet and warning about danger. Because oxytocin drives what Shelley Taylor would call, it's a rather soppy title, but tend and befriend rather than fight or flight. And tend and befriend is this much pilloried instinct women have to talk to each other when things go badly wrong and pick up the phone and go, oh, what's happened to me, and all that gossip, which actually, if you think about it in game theory terms, is incredibly useful, because what are you doing? You're sharing information to try and optimize outcomes. So there's some really interesting commentary on what happened during the credit crunch in 2008 about what really stopped the markets. And what stopped the markets was the banks physically stopped talking to each other about the LIBOR. And that was a classic, beautiful, entirely understandable zero-sum game fight or flight response, which is, I'm not going to share any information about our dreadful toxic situation because I don't want anyone to know about it. And if I give the game away and show my hand, then I will be strategically disadvantaged. And you can entirely understand why that would just sound normal, feel normal, and be exactly how you would behave. Jane Angardia, who was the only woman running a retail bank at the time, had the temerity to get straight on the phone to the regulator and say, oh gosh, it's a disaster, what do we do? And the chaps who were running the other banks were furious with her for breaking ranks. They were like, how dare you phone the regulator without us all agreeing at first? But she, again, physiologically speaking, thought, well, that's what you do. You pick up the phone and say, oh, crikey, mickety me, what's going on? What do we do about it? And you wonder whether all the banks had been run by women and they had actually phoned each other up and said, we've got this dreadful problem with toxic debt and CDOs, whether actually we might have had some better outcomes slightly earlier on. And this plays out in all kinds of public policy situations where there's a hunkering down mentality, which is physiologically rewarded in male physiology because it makes you feel great, victorious, all that kind of stuff. And it's just very specifically a male response. And it's not wrong. It's incredibly helpful, but in particular situations. And actually, in many situations, an instinct to collaborate, to reach out, to communicate will tend to get you better outcomes. So competition is one of these toxic assumptions that has been useful, can be useful, but should be used more sparingly than it is. And many companies know this already. They're already collaborating. And, in the car industry, there are now very few factories that make all the chassis, and then you just bung a different type of door on, a different type of badge or whatever, because they realize that actually collaborating over supply chain and the very expensive things to do with manufacturing makes sense, because then you can differentiate on price, brand, proposition, all those kinds of things. So there's lots of industries where they're already realizing that you should collaborate for as far down the chain as you possibly can before you compete, because in an environment where we're really struggling with sustainability in the world's resources, just duplicating effort in order to keep pure and compete directly across all of these different environments is just madness. Yet the law still absolutely holds that competition must be maintained at all costs. So recently, not so recently now, Unilever got absolutely clobbered by the competition authority because they had decided that in the interests of the environment, they would try and not only find a way to make their detergent more concentrated so that there would be less of it to transport around in terms of supply chain costs, but they would try and make it as effective with cold water as with hot, because then that would reduce it would make it more available to people who don't have access to hot water usefully, but also it would reduce the costs of needing to heat water in order to use detergent. So they decided to call a meeting with everyone else in the supply chain to say, just to let you know, this is what we're doing, because it'll have an effect on how we share lorries and share pallets and share transport and all that. And the Competition Authority were furious and gave them a massive fine for meeting with their competitors and doing collusion and price fixing and all that kind of thing. So again, a mistake. They should have invited the regulators to the meeting, but a really good instinct, which was all about how do we try and solve a collective problem about the environment and all these things. But it was seen as an anti-competitive practice, and there's still quite a lot of that around. So that's something which is fairly entrenched and needs challenging because it's bad maths and it's also, frankly, a bit sexist. So the other thing, I have a wonderful puppet here who looks suspiciously like the speaker you're having quite soon, don't you think, Rowan Williams? I think he looks very wizardly. He looks like a cross between the former Archbishop of Canterbury and Dumbledore, I think. And I have this puppet here because the thing that really goes sort of hand in hand with competition in thinking about toxic assumptions is the invisible hand. You heard of the invisible hand? And we must all relax because the invisible hand will sort it all out. And Adam Smith coined this phrase actually in a paper he wrote about the movement of the planets and things like that. And he called it psychic balm to make us all relax, because if we thought there was an invisible hand controlling everything, then we could go sleep well at night. And of course, in his day and age, 18th century Edinburgh, most people believed in a god of some kind. And so it was kind of code for a nice chap like Rowan sitting up there, sorting it all out for you, having a chat with God and making sure everything tended towards the good. So what we're told these days is we mustn't do anything to trammel the markets. We mustn't have all this terrible, boring regulation, because actually what you need to do is make the markets as free as you possibly can, as few rules as you possibly can introduce, because you need to leave the invisible hand free to do its magic and make it all work out. And it does sound fantastic. And every so often you see those wonderful murmurations of starlings and you think, that's so true. And you look at the flocking of any bird population, you look at the shoaling of fish and you think, oh, this amazing ability nature has to self-organize, that must be what it's all about. And you think the invisible hand must be true, it feels true. And particularly if you're religious, you think, well, of course God's just doing a bit of tweaking and poking and sending the odd angel down to shove people around a bit and it's all fine. But actually, if you think about those lovely Attenborough programs, those shoals flock straight into the mouths of sharks, don't they? And those lovely flocks of birds go straight into the mouth of a jet engine. Self-organization does not necessarily tend towards a good teleology. And this is the problem with the myth of the invisible hand, because what it means in a market, if you think about what an old-fashioned marketplace is in the middle of York or Leeds or Harrogate, people used to pitch up with their wares and swap them around, sell them, because they had a particularly good cabbage crop that year, but they had a blight on their carrots. It was all about messages of supply and demand. And so the thing is, if there is an invisible hand and there are no rules, then it is just all about your votes in the market, who has more muscle in the market. And that means that you have extraordinary markets for, plastic surgery and water in plastic bottles and £1 million handbags and, extraordinary things. And you have less of a market for retroviral drugs and, things that can, clean water in the third world and all those kinds of things, because there are no messages in the market demanding those. So the thing that worries me about this myth of the invisible hand is it's actually a way of protecting the rich and powerful, because their votes will always count more in the market because there are more of them. And we're seeing that viscerally in the moment in the UK, where everyone is being clobbered except the rich, who are getting huge amounts of sort of tax cuts and are all buggering off to Bermuda and all other kinds of tax havens and hiding their money offshore. And it's because they have more votes in the market, and they're more able to lobby people and, you know, make things work in their favor, because the invisible hand lets them, unless you intervene as a state to say there are certain things we don't think are right, you know, hence progressive taxation, all those things, and like introducing the NHS anyway, because otherwise, as you see in so many other countries, only the rich can afford healthcare and education and all those other things. So the invisible hand, really dodgy, because it's basically a cry by the rich to say, leave us to it. And in those days when we all trusted the rich and famous and all of the kind of grown-ups, that was fine. But I think what history has taught us is that's a dangerous assumption to make, that that's a benevolent force, because there's plenty of evidence that it's not benevolent at all. So those are the first two big toxic assumptions, the invisible hand and competition. And hot foot behind them, there is an assumption about utility. And the idea is that when you're competing, the invisible hand should leave you to it, and every individual within the market will maximize their own utility. You might have heard that jargon, and it's all about doing your own thing, and everyone should leave you to get on with it, and you'll just, you know, have a happy life. And to illustrate utility, I've got a fish oven glove, because I want to talk to you about what happens about utility if you're not very careful about it. And this is the tragedy of the commons, which again is some jargon that you might have heard. And what's happened in many oceans is that, for instance, in Newfoundland, in the 90s, they found the cod had been fished out. And it's only now that they have started reintroducing cod fishing, you know, 25 years later, actually 35 years later, because there was no fish left. And that was entirely because all these individual little fishing boats were doing invisible hand competition utility. They were all just trying to fish their socks off, getting up at dawn, trotting about in their fish with their nets, trying to get as much fish as they possibly could to go back home, sell it in the market in order to feed their families, you know, buy them healthcare, send them to school. Absolutely admirable thing to do. The problem is, if every single person is going off in their own individual little fishing boat, maximizing their own utility, and competing with each other like mad to do so, the invisible hand in that situation is just meaning that those Grand Rapids sandbanks just got fished out and there was no cod left. And a whole generation of fishermen lost their trade because there was no cod left. 35 years of no cod fishing in Newfoundland after generations of it, because of greed. Because the problem about utility is it's just a license to do your own thing. So if your utility is child molestation or, you know, armaments or terrorism or whatever, technically speaking, the market won't stop you, because the market is saying, you know, we must all compete like mad, maximize our own utility, and the invisible hand will fix it. And again, that's rather assuming no sin. And of course, if the market was entirely run by angels, that might be a sensible thing. But just saying, you know, it's a free-for-all, and as long as you maximize your own utility, you'll be fine, mate, because the invisible hand just leaves a very individualistic market careering out of control as the rich take over and do their own thing. The other thing that's rather alarming about utility is it ushers in an ethic of utilitarianism. And again, if you remember what that is all about, it's all about the greatest good for the greatest number, and it's about optimizing outcomes. And again, for a religious audience, that's kind of worrying, because it says that the end always justifies the means. And you can behave as badly as you like, as long as, qua invisible hand, everything's fine at the end. And anyone with any sort of religious sensibility will think that that kind of does violence to something we hold very dear, which is how you behave and why you do things is also really important and morally salient and ethically crucial. It's not just about outcomes. So utility is, again, one of those assumptions which has become toxic, because it leads to tragedies of the commons, it leads to the despolation of the earth, it has the reason that we have overfished and over farms and over fertilized and trashed the earth. And it also leads to an ethic which is now embedded in all public policy thinking in the West, which is partial, because utilitarianism isn't really the only game in town, leaves a lot to be desired. And the thing about utility, the invisible hand, and competition, they lead to this slightly odd way of thinking about prices in the market. And I've got a nice sale banner here because it's January and we're in sort of sale territory. I used to love the January sales, getting all my spending money from Christmas and rushing off to Edinburgh to the shops. And I don't know if you remember your scholastics and just price theory. But there used to be a very old-fashioned conversation, which is that how much profit you were going to, how much margin you were going to put on something, and therefore how much profit you were going to make, was a really ethically interesting question, and was important, because what you would do is you'd figure out how much it cost you to buy, the paper and the ink to create your books, and then you'd factor in a bit for your effort and your labor, and then that's what the price would be. And this was the thinking for a long time, not only in terms of goods and services, but also in the conversations about usury, actually, when in Christianity they started thinking about kind of acceptable cost of money, in terms of, if you were going to charge interest, what would a reasonable amount of interest be? And the fact there was a ceiling on that for so long was based on this same thinking about price, and that price is linked to cost. Now, the problem about free market economics and the kind of markets we're in now is those lovely graphs that you see economists doing all the time, those equilibrium graphs where supply meets demand at a particular price and the market clears. And, if any of you ever had to sit through these economics lectures, they put these graphs up all the time and freak me out. But they're also really terrible thinking, because it means how much is the price of a cup of coffee? Well, if you go to the railway station and you buy a coffee there, it'll cost one thing. If you go to Fortnum Mason's, to the tea room there, and you buy coffee, it'll cost something entirely different. It changes, doesn't it, the price of coffee, because it depends the brand associated with it, the situation, where you are, whether you want it in fancy cups or whether you want it in a placky container, whatever it might be. Because now the right price is the price the market will bear. And so what tends to happen is something gets invented and they think, well, what will the suckers pay for this? And they think, oh, it's a very nice pen. Let's put it in at £25 and say it's exclusive and has been used by Lady Gaga. And then everyone rushes about going, £25, that's a bargain. I'll pay you 50. And then all of a sudden this pen becomes worth £750. When in fact, if you look at it, and you look at the constituent parts, it probably costs about 5 or 6p to make, don't you think? And so maybe a reasonable margin on that would say, with all the transport and everything else, you might say 15, 20p. You might add a bit on as a tax for, the fact you're using plastic and you're using transport and your externalities and stuff. And so it might end up being a bit higher than that. But actually it's not worth, £750, is it? It really isn't. But we have got into this crazy situation in the market where price has got nothing to do with cost anymore. And why I really worry about that is for the reason that tradecraft has just gone under, by the way, you probably heard that devastating news in the Northeast, is they made this point. They said, you're paying for this coffee, but you're not paying a fair price. And actually, when you start looking at what it costs, what this coffee really costs, you need to start adding in extra, what they called that premium, that fair trade premium. And we got used to that, didn't we? We were very happy to overpay comparatively for fair trade because we appreciated they were trying to price back in something that we held dear. And that happened with organics. It's happened with lots of other categories. Then, of course, the supermarkets got on the case, and now they just think, oh, excellent, the middle classes will pay extra for that kind of ethical product. And then they just cream off the profits, and it goes nowhere near the growers or anyone else. But it also airbrushes out the conversation tradecraft were trying to make us have, which is, well, what's going on there? What are the real costs of this? So whenever you do the math in America on how much the gas, the petrol costs them, when you start factoring in all the wars they have to fight around the world, all of the protection for all the oil wells, all the transport, all the taxes they have to pay, all the subsidies, and all of the cleanup operations they need to be because of what happens when there are spillages. You know, the couple of dollars you're paying in the gas station are nowhere near enough to pay for the cost of oil and gas. And you see that everywhere. It's the conversation we're now having in earnest because of what we've noticed we've done to the planet. And we had forgotten to have that conversation because pricing had just disappeared away from cost into whatever the market will bear. And we'd forgotten that it's only by being really, really clear about cost that you can get a clear sense of price. So you go in the underground in London, you see these adverts for all these internet companies saying, beautiful dress, £7.99. And you think, there's no way that dress costs £7.99. Because the only reason you can charge that cheaper price is because you are not obeying the rules. You're either indulging in really dodgy trade practices, or you're manipulating people, or you're playing games with tax, or you're doing something, because you couldn't even buy the material for that in this country. You certainly couldn't buy the labor. And if you think about design and everything else on top of it, you start thinking that that's just a lie. So I'd like you to be really careful about pricing, and think about when you are buying stuff, what is that price about? And actually, one of the things that is a real challenge for all of us is that we should really not be impressed with cheap anymore. And I grew up in a family where we didn't have a huge amount of money, and it was all about bargains and things that were cheap. But when you start thinking about why they're cheap and who else is bearing the cost for you getting something cheap, then that starts driving different decisions in the market. Okay, so how are you doing? Are you surviving Economics 101 so far? So we've got a couple more, 3 more to go through, and then I'm going to talk about consumerism proper. And I have my CCTV camera. Did you know that you can buy fake CCTV cameras? So you can stick them on your house and then everyone thinks that you've got like a really fantastic alarm system. Anyway, I've bought this fake CCTV camera to show you because I want to talk about another toxic assumption to do with agency theory. So this is the principal agent problem in economic theory, and it's based on this idea that you have the owners of capital and you have the workers, and the problem that owners of capital have is these workers are all blighters, aren't they? They're constantly mucking about and striking and skiving and nicking stuff. So what you need to do as an owner of capital is you need to think of all kinds of ways to keep an eye on them, you know, through surveillance. You know, all those kinds of ghastly sort of Orwellian towers and CCTV footage and keystroke counting and clocking in, clocking out and objective setting and all this HR policy we're very familiar with, all the metrics and the measurements and all that sort of stuff, which is about keeping an eye on these recalcitrant workers, because we all know, don't we, that they're all skivers, and if they take your eye off them a minute, they'll be taking the mickey. So the agency theory issue is that there is this absolute assumption that the owner of capital and their worker are not aligned, and the workers will try and do everything in their devious powers to stop the owners of capital doing well and making profits. And so over time that has driven some really bizarre behavior in markets, particularly in the way that we think about how we organize organizations and structures and HR and all these things. And this is one of the things that has absolutely crept out into all kinds of non-capitalist spaces like universities and the judiciary and churches and everywhere else, which is about trying to control the workers because of this agency theory assumption. Now, this was what got me onto toxic assumptions in the first place, because as a Christian, I find that dead offensive, don't you? The idea that we're all born wicked. You know, I know there is a doctrine of original sin, but I mean, do we really look at a baby and think these days, outrageous, it is doomed to fail because of original sin? And this was a very Freudian analysis that very few psychologists would support anymore, that there are these drives and that, you know, there's no way we can possibly come to the good. And that's certainly not a Christian message. So I started thinking, why is it that we are hell-bent on these extraordinary maneuvers to try and control the workers because of this very dodgy assumption about what people are really like? And when you start noticing all the experiments there have been, when you actually trust people and you're clear with them about what the deal is, I'll pay you to do this and I'd like you to think about that. There are now many, many more examples of people behaving really well. And I wrote this book before COVID, but COVID was a brilliant example of that. The thing about furlough and those payments was we were literally paying people to do nothing, weren't we? Now, if agency theory was right, all those people who weren't at work would have immediately hit the streets and started mugging grannies and, you know, exercising graffiti and taking drugs and generally behaving really badly, setting everyone on fire, because of course we're all recalcitrant and naughty, aren't we? And, you know, if you give us an inch, we'll take a mile. And what do people do during lockdown? They made banana bread, they collected prescriptions for their neighbours, they chatted to their, you know, birds for once, you know, they indulged in some reading. You know, we didn't also hit the streets and end up needing to be banged up in jail because we were also naughty with all this free cash being given from the government. And it's not like as soon as an old age pensioner gets their pension, they start sort of looting and stealing and becoming recalcitrant. It is very uncommon. Actually, we're having strikes at the moment for some very good reasons, but you know, this very old-fashioned idea that that people are sort of naturally inclined to rob, cheat, and steal is just not supported in any evidence whatsoever. And the thing about this absolute assumption about the principal agent problem is it's ushered in one of my other worst toxic assumptions. Now, here is Santa for you, and Santa is for me to talk to you about shareholder value. So if you have this issue that as the owners of capital, you're very worried that all the workers are just going to steal from you, then what you do is you start thinking about how you could protect yourself from that. And in the 70s, it's quite modern, this idea, by the way. In the 70s, they came up with this idea called shareholder value, which is a bit like that sort of the only business of businesses business idea that you've heard of that Freeman came up with. Is the idea that the only thing that business needs to do is honor its shareholders. And as long as you keep your shareholders happy, everything will be fine. It's sort of invisible hand thinking again. And on the face of it, that sounds like a really sensible idea, because of course these shareholders, you know, they sacrificed everything, didn't they, to set you up in the first place. They got their hard-earned pensions out and the money that their great granny left them, and they put them into your business in order to allow you to buy a factory and buy machines and employ people and start up. And so it feels like it's the right thing to do to kind of keep them in socks in their old age. So of course your decision making is going to be perfect if you just focus on the shareholder. The problem about the shareholder, and I apologize to those of you who may still believe in Santa Claus, is that he's been used as a Santa Claus figure. And the tooth fairy and all those other things, because if you think about who the shareholder actually is, so if you think about an ordinary PLC like Tesco or something, and you try and phone up a shareholder, who would you get? You know, if you had an AGM and you had them all in the room and you were going to sort of video it, and they were there on the basis of for how long they had held a share, and the AGM might last 20 minutes, an hour, or something like that, there'd be very few seats that would be occupied for the duration of that meeting, because there are some pension funds that tend to hold shares in the long term. But now with the advent of automated trading and all these bots who sort of get on the internet and do sort of whizzy aroundy in split seconds, and you'll know about all these cables they're building and all the kind of clever things they get up to kind of have sub-second trades. And there's an incredible thing going on in hedge funds to try and figure out how quickly you can get a trade through, so you can make incredible gains by trading, you know, millionths of a second. The average time they reckon a share is held for now, it used to be several years. In the 40s, it was down to about 4 years, I think. In the 60s, 70s, it became about a year. And then in the 80s and 90s, it was about 4 to 6 months. Because of automated trading, and this is disputed because, of course, it's very hard to get the stats on this, they reckon it's anywhere between about 11 and 22 seconds that a share is held for because of the volume of trading. So these shareholders, they're going up and down like a yo-yo through this AGM. I mean, you know, it's a blur. You've got a couple of blokes snoozing in a chair from the pension funds. Everyone else is, you know, up and down like yo-yo. So whenever they say, oh, the shareholder, you have to think to yourself, well, Santa Claus. Because who is the shareholder? Who is the shareholder they're talking about? Because they probably don't even know who their shareholders are, because it's all done by intermediaries these days. And it's never really about the beneficial owner. It's about trying to make margins on deals. So shareholder and shareholder value, and particularly because of this problem about agency theory, is they thought it'd be a really good idea to make sure that all the chief exec and all the people on the board had stock options, because then you would naturally align the interests of the owners and the workers through management by having them be shareholders too. And we've seen that has been the most corrupting influence you could possibly think of, because now all chief execs need to do is manipulate the share price. That's their only interest, and it's the only thing that they are really motivated, well, certainly incentivized to worry about. Is not what the operation is doing and investing in that and worrying about that, but being forensically interested in what's happening to your share price. And it drives incredibly short-term thinking, particularly because these chief execs, they never last more than 5 years. The average is about 3, I think. They're all on very, very particular deals that are particularly structured. It's not really in their interest to worry about whether this company is still going to be here in 300 years. They just need to know that they're going to get their stock options when they go, and that they're going to be going at the right point in the market so they can maximize those. So again, it's driven some terrible practices that are not particularly based even on law. So in the shareholder spring in America, they decided that they were going to just not let shareholders come because the shareholders were all being naughty. And so loads of corporations wouldn't even let them in. So if you think about what a shareholder actually in law can do, they can own the share, they can sell the share, they're entitled to a dividend, they can collectively call an AGM. But even in law in America, they couldn't even attend the AGM in some cases. I think in this country you still can. But if you think about what in law a shareholder is compared to what in law an employee is, what a supplier is, all these other parties actually are much more important to the day-to-day operation than a shareholder could ever be. And those original shareholders, the nice chaps you're trying to keep in socks, they departed a very long time ago. So again, this is one of those things like the invisible hand, which is just about trying to keep us all compliant and behaving. Graham has just put a comment in about co-ops, and this is brilliant, a segue into my last toxic assumption, which is about ownership structures, because as you can imagine, this is driving some very, very strange thinking about what the right ownership structure is. So I want to talk to you about limited liability. So this is a share certificate for a limited liability company. And limited liability was a brilliant, brilliant initiative. Hilariously, the French got there first, so there was a massive fight in London to try and establish limited liability to catch up with the French, because the French had realised that if you're building massive things like railways and in this country canals and huge projects, there's no way one person could finance those. So you're going to have to get stacks of people involved, and they were all done privately because again the governments couldn't raise taxes quickly enough to fund these really, really, really huge infrastructure projects. So you had a whole load of private individuals putting in a load of money, who had learned through, what used to happen with boats going missing and everything going horribly wrong, that liability was quite a problem, because you would go bankrupt overnight and have to sell everything. And so a deal was done that you could apply through Parliament actually for status as a limited liability outfit, because that would mean that you could have lots of people who'd be willing to put money in to build these huge things, because they wouldn't ultimately lose out. So again, a bit like competition and some of these other assumptions, it was a really good wheeze at the time. And we wouldn't have an awful lot of the public institutions and public building projects that we have had it not been for this brilliant, brilliant, innovative model of limited liability. But as you say in the chat, co-ops are a very different sort of thought about how you might collaborate in order to produce some product or service in a market. Because limited liability, and again, we know this from all the research and the statistics, drives some really bad thinking, because no one ever pays. I mean, they had to introduce charges like corporate manslaughter and legal personality of corporations, because otherwise you couldn't hold these outfits to account at all. Because if actually you've got nothing to lose as a company, then why behave well, really? And why not play the markets and overinvest in debt as opposed to investing in staff or R&D or whatever? There's some really odd decision making driven by a combination of a limited liability vehicle and shareholder value, that means that a lot of corporations are just making decisions which are only about financial engineering and really nothing to do with the Commonwealth and what would be good for society. So my worry about limited liability is it has served a purpose. It can be a very useful vehicle. But when you look at the UK as an example, 98% of all our organisations are limited liability, whether they're partnerships or PLCs. And that is a monopoly, actually, which, again, we're not supposed to approve of because it drives out innovation. And it also makes you it's a vulnerability because diversity gives you strength, and it gives you resilience. And if you only have one business model, then you start having all of these bad behaviors coming in because it becomes the only game in town. So when I set up my own company, because I'd left Ashridge as an employee to have my children, but I still needed to do some work for them to finish off some work with clients. And as a charity, they're not allowed to pay you if you aren't a sort of registered thing. So I couldn't be a charity. So I tried to figure out, could I be one of these sort of community initiatives or something like that. And again, because I only had a week to set this up before I was doing my first bit of work for Ashridge, the only thing I was allowed to be was a limited liability partnership in my case, because I could not find a lawyer and accountant who would do anything else. So if you think about all the professional services firms that we have in this country, they're very specialized because 98% of their clients only want one service. So again, if you're trying to think about the huge problems that we have in this country when you are trying to be a cooperative or you're trying to do employee ownership, it's taking years to build up the kind of expertise we need to make that possible. So, if you decided that you wanted Tesco to go employee owned, that would actually now be more possible than it was 10 years ago, because there have been enough companies who have gone employee owned to show how you do that. But it's very difficult to structure that financially, given that not every employee would have enough money to buy Tesco. So you need a lot of people who would be able to understand what you're trying to do, to get involved, to create financial instruments to make that kind of thing work. But again, no one is incentivized to do so because 98% of the game in town is about limited liability. So we are vulnerable, I think, just in terms of our economy, because we're overcommitted to one particular business model. And again, I think you're absolutely right, Graham. I think if we had more co-ops, if we had more employee ownership, John Lewis is a brilliant example of this. If we had more of those, then you start driving different kinds of behaviors in the market, different kinds of decision making, which are not a million miles away from bog standard capitalism as we recognize it, but have the potential to take other things into account and to behave better as citizens within the economy. So I'm just going to look, Graham's also got a question here about if people are good and can be trusted as workers, why do they act differently as directors or CEOs? Well, I think what's happened is a very practical reason why they do, which is that unless you're in an employee-owned situation, the workers don't have shares, but the directors and CEOs do. So you now align them with the owners of capital through this shareholder value routine, and they then are incentivized to behave very differently from workers and to see themselves in opposition to workers in a very Marxist sort of a way that isn't, to me, very natural, normal, or justifiable. So I think it becomes disfiguring. All these 7 things, when they start working together and reinforcing each other, they have disfigured the way that we behave in organizations, and are disfiguring other places now, as we've talked about, the academic community and the judiciary and the health service and education and the church. Because we have sort of imagined that these are sort of healthy routines, we've borrowed them and not always borrowed them knowing what we're borrowing. And then they become disfiguring in our community as well. And Tav the Spotted John Lewis, absolutely, and Lochfine and lots of others trying to do it. But again, if you're as big as John Lewis, unless it's of long standing, it's quite hard to sort of pivot from PLC to employee ownership overnight. But there are companies who are trying to do that. And if there was a bit more encouragement in public policy, I mean, for instance, the Treasury could copper bottom some of these things and guarantee them over the longer term to provide a transition financially for some of these companies to change. But that would need a commitment from the government to do that. So that's my whistle-stop tour of capitalism and the toxic assumptions of capitalism. We're going to have a break in about 10 minutes, but I want to use the 10 minutes before we have that break to talk more specifically about consumerism, which, as I mentioned when I started, is, in my view, the sort of software that runs on this hardware, which are these rules, these toxic assumptions I've talked about. And this is much more about the second book, the Buying God book, and talks about I suppose more about the theology, but really also about sort of what's going on psychologically behind all of this stuff when we're thinking about our response as Christians to the market and to consumerism. And there's quite a lot of literature, particularly coming out of America, that is very anti-capitalist, and it's sort of there was a lot of anti-capitalism through the South American liberation theology. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, brilliant stuff, very Marxist, very much about recognizing the imbalances these kinds of things create. But that was kind of the only critique of economics for really many generations, and is quite particular and coming from a very particular experience in those countries. When the Americans started getting into anti-capitalism in the sort of 90s, maybe some 80s, but mainly the 90s. Again, it was sort of a bit ranty, and it was about the sort of technologies of capitalism to do with desire. And desire is a really big thing, that we've got these technologies of desire that are taking us away from God. And I just want to talk about that because I think it is true that consumerism disfigures our sense of what we want and manipulates that and uses that manipulation to drive tendencies and behaviors. But I want to talk first about desire proper, because there's some very interesting thinking on this that I think it's worth remembering. So one of the things is the mystic Thomas Traherne. And this is, I got into this because of that lovely collect by St. Augustine, I think it is, which is about our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee. That sense that we're kind of hardwired to yearn. And there's this brilliant thing in, this is the Thomas Traherne Centuries Meditations. He says, it is of the nobility of man's soul that he is insatiable, for he hath a benefactor so prone to give, that he delighteth in us for asking. Do not your inclinations tell you that the world is yours? Do you not covet it at all? Do you not long to have it? And I think Traherne is coming from a very different place to say, yearning isn't the problem. Yearning is what we're conditioned to do, because if you're a creator and you spin off your creation, made in your image, then there's a homing device in there, which is about trying to find your way back. So we are born to yearn. And what Rowan Williams beautifully says, and you can ask him about this when you see him, is that we've just got to understand that we're never going to fix yearning. It's not going to go away, until we do finally meet God, because it's part of our birthright. What we need to understand is that there's nothing that can fix us in this lifetime. So he talks about there's no hole to fill. You buy the Nike trainers and bingo, you're done. It's not like the next coffee will transfigure you. It doesn't work like that. And rather than to switch off yearnings in that very sort of Scottish Presbyterian or sort of East Coast American sort of Puritan way, it's not about suppressing them and stopping them and saying they're evil and of the devil. It's saying yearnings are normal, they're our birthright, they're good. But because they are yearnings, we need to be really careful about the tractor beams involved. And this is why I asked for Matthew at the beginning, because of course, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. You cannot serve both God and mammon. And this is about tractor beams. So if you get obsessed with everything you're being fed by the markets, then of course you will yearn for all of those things for all kinds of good reasons. And again, Peter Sedgwick, beautiful thinker, he says, when you start looking at the history of consumerism, you start noticing that it's built on this very, very understandable human need for self-identity. And what we tend to do is we try and create who we are through how we show up. And again, there's no big secret to this. If you think about the story of the Garden of Eden, the second they put on those damn fig leaves, that's when it all went horribly wrong, didn't it? Oh, well, my fig leaf, is a very trendy, beautiful, new, modern fig leaf, and it's much bigger than yours. As soon as you're aware of how other people are perceiving you, and that you are perceived, and that you are in community, everything kicks off. And you start wanting to look good, feel good, be appreciated, be loved, all those very, very human things that can just turn into really bad behavior around, how we want to be perceived and trying to manipulate that. And a lovely piece of research about vervet monkeys on this, which was some of the stuff behind some of the drugs of depression about serotonin. And they found that vervet monkeys, they're in a sort of pack, and there's hierarchies and all that. And the vervet monkeys who are sort of superior in the group produce more serotonin. They feel better about themselves because they are further up in the hierarchy. And the researchers did some very interesting stuff where they kind of moved them around in the hierarchy, and their serotonin would reduce if they were deposed by a sort of superior monkey. And they found that the only thing that would otherwise make your serotonin plummet was if they parked a monkey in front of a mirror. And then they would get instantly depressed. So there's some really interesting stuff about who are we comparing ourselves to, and needing to compare ourselves. And again, René Girard and all this stuff about mimetic desire would talk about this from a more secular point of view, that we're born into community. We care about how other people perceive us and how we show up with them. And again, if we aren't well directed on that in terms of what are we really yearning for, we can get sucked into a whole load of signaling behavior and one-upmanship and all the stuff we know about, which is just human frailty, which consumerism absolutely rejoices in. So consumerism knows that the only reason it works is because of newness. So when you've had that fig leaf for a week, it's an old fig leaf now, and someone else has just plucked a new fig leaf off the fig tree and is looking much more glamorous than you are. So you need a new one instantly. So capitalism wouldn't work if your phone lasted forever, or if your bread maker never broke down, or your shoes never wore out. So it's in capitalism's interest to constantly have innovation, and to have built-in obsolescence, as we know, because that drives repeat purchasing. Because things that are new are only new until you bought them, and then they're old. So we need novelty. We need one-upmanship. So again, as soon as we've got it and everyone else has got it, it's no longer different and special. So we have to find something else that's different and special to cheer us up. And you get driven into this sort of arms race where you need novelty. And you get that kind of feeling, that kind of adrenaline kick, that vervet monkey serotonin reward. But then it goes away again. And this is why smartphones are such an extraordinary tool of consumerism, because they kind of turbocharge that software. So they know that those pings, those likes, all those things that happen on your phone produce dopamine. And that actually is a very sneaky thing that isn't so much a reward as a kind of signal that you need to try and do a repeat behavior to get it again, and becomes addictive. So the reason that we've got so much poor mental health in teens is because they're driven into this quite toxic chemical culture where you have to keep having those likes and those pings and all those things to feel normal, because you're driven into this sort of expectation. And this is all part of the same toxicity, which is about trying to keep up with the Joneses, which is as old as time, certainly as old as Adam and Eve, and is about that yearning and wanting to be held in a community, to be loved and appreciated and all those kinds of things, but having the tractor being kind of slightly off. So I want to finish up on this by just talking about how you might fight back, really, because an awful lot of this is not to deny these things because our yearning is part of us, but to try and figure out how would you fix your gaze on Christ and how would you keep it there. And an awful lot of this, you get the resources for it in Christianity proper, but also in thinking about virtue ethics. How do you build your character so that when you do see that amazing advert of all those cool people doing that cool thing and you think, oh, I want to be like them and then I'll be perfect and loved. How do you say, no, nonsense, go to church? How do you kind of train yourself away from this alluring messaging, which is ever present and incredibly technically competent, and fueled by extraordinary data that will find your every vulnerability, and particularly if you're on social media, it'll be tracking your every mood so it can tailor to the times when you're most likely to spend, and give you exactly what will be the thing that Rowan Williams says you think you need to fill that hole, to make you whole. And I want to talk about something incredibly prosaic, which is your bank statements. So I don't know how many of you still get them physically, how many of you get them online, but I love bank statements, because I think if you were going to show up at the pearly gates and St. Peter was going to say, right, we're going to have a chat about you as an economic citizen, I mean, where would you start with that? But actually, here's one of my bank statements. This you can't hide from. This is everywhere you've been and everything you've spent and where you spent it. And it's very sobering, because when I first started doing this exercise, you have to Google things, because half the time you can't remember what that company was and what on earth you were doing on the 5th or whatever it was. 29p, what was that? And as soon as you start Googling these things, you start thinking, ooh, and you start looking at their record in supply chain, you start looking at whether they're paying taxes and whether they've got loads of employees taking them to court for bad behavior and what their, green credentials are. And you start thinking, if this is about votes in the market, what am I voting for? Am I voting for God or am I voting for Mammon? And there's lots of things we can do to change the world. We know about salt and light. We know that if there are enough of us doing the right thing, like Tradecraft did, we can create a whole new market. That's what they did beautifully, is they created fair trade from nothing. And now everyone is doing fair trade. It's a normal thing that you can do in shops, is buy fair trade. And it's ushered in a whole load of really healthy practices just by a few committed Christians keeping doing it for long enough till it caught on. So we know we can create change in the market. It's about just figuring out how we want to apply that pressure and where. And I think looking at your own bank statement is a great place to start, because it then makes you curious about other bank statements, maybe your church's bank statement, your organization's bank statement, your family's bank statements. How do you feel your bank statement? Would you take it to your vicar? Would you, some people don't even show it to their spouse, do they? Would you show it to your boss? Would you show it to your kids? Because actually you can't hide from your bank statement. So what I've done with mine, I have marked it up with some, they're supposed to be reds and ambers, by the way, but my highlighter pens are a bit kind of random. And what I've tried to do is figure out which of these transactions are votes for the kingdom and which are definitely not. So I've got some which are definitely not. So I've got all my supermarkets in there, not because I hate supermarkets, by the way. Supermarkets have been revolutionizing. But again, in the economy, they don't always have a benevolent effect. And some of them don't behave very well, particularly around their suppliers. So generally, I try and avoid supermarkets if I can, although obviously most of us will also use supermarkets as part of our general spending patterns. I've given myself some reds for just kind of commercial on-the-fly things. So, when I've been in train stations and I've whizzed into Benugo and Old Bar One, and, I've done these things because I'm on the hoof and I'm like, I'm rushing, I need a coffee. That's bad planning on my part, really, isn't it? When you end up doing these kind of stress purchases and going to places you wouldn't really normally go to, just because you haven't really got your head around it. I've also given myself some reds for PayPal, because PayPal, we use that online all the time. I kind of love PayPal on the one hand because it has allowed a huge number of people to be able to be in a market when they don't have money for the bricks and mortar. But actually they can be online. So I love how that facilitates smaller economic activity. But I think PayPal itself, a bit like the Amazons of this world, they don't really pay taxes properly. I've got lots of greens on here for local shopping and for charity shops, also for giving to charity, going to the pub. Must support your local pub, very important. That's a great place for everyone across the great divides to meet. Important for community. I've got a couple of donations in there. I've given myself some greens for the money I've earned, because I feel that has come from virtuous places for doing virtuous work. I don't have my utility bills on this, but again, interesting to think about when did you last go through and figure out, are you on the right, are you with the right companies, particularly now when that's quite a costly decision to make. Also, where are you banking? I'm still with HSBC, and I have to say I'm sorry if there are any lawyers on this call. I shouldn't really be with HSBC because I don't really approve of their practices. But again, trying to find a bank, particularly because I've got to have a register, because my company's registered, I've got to have a business bank account. It's very hard to find an ethical one. So I'm still working on that. I think Yorkshire Building Society is the one everyone recommends, so I must move to them. I've got some greens in here for cash, because a lot of local businesses have to pay quite high fees if they use electronic things. Obviously with COVID we're having to do that a lot anyway, but using cash can sometimes be quite helpful. So the idea about the sort of bank statement workout is for you to just get more curious. In the first instance, don't beat yourself up about it, but in the first instance, try and just do a kind of red, amber, green whiz through and think, which of these transactions am I really proud of? And which transactions do I sort of think, oh, I could have thought harder about that, or maybe taken more time or done more research. And then can you over time just get more familiar with where your money's going and who you're supporting, who you're voting for? And can you start tweaking that and changing it? Can you start moving your money around? Where's your money coming from? Are you happy if you're getting pension payments in there? Are you happy that you've actually given them a mandate about where you want your money invested? Are you sure that's not just shoring up the oil majors? Is that going to the right kinds of investment plays that you think would be ethical? Yeah, and what's happening about your charity giving? Do you think those charities are actually behaving well? Some of them maybe more so than others. The other thing I'd say, just before we have a break on this, it is to reinforce this about local spending, because there was a really interesting piece of research done by the New Economics Foundation. They wanted to know what happens when your money's spent. Where does it go? Does it kind of evaporate? And they did this sort of blue hands experiment where they imagined we'd all been sort of messy church getting our blue paint on our hands. And they wanted to know if you spent £1 in a shop, how much blue paint would it get on it from going from one pair of hands to the other before it ended up kind of being finished, being spent? And they discovered that if you went to a chain store, like one of the big supermarkets or whatever, with your £1, it wouldn't really get any blue paint on it other than yours, because it would tend to go straight to head office, possibly offshore, who knows. And it would end up being worth 36p. Your £1 would fall in value to being worth 36p to your local economy, because it would leave fairly immediately. But they found that if you spent your £1 in a local shop, and there's a lovely video they made in Shetland about this, about a wee boy during lockdown, actually, when they allowed us to go back out to shops, experimenting, trying to figure out where his money went. And he goes into one shop and with his mum, and he's buying a jumper or something. And they give the money to the lady. And the lady, she's having a bit of a boring time in the shop because no one's there. So she's like, I'll just go and pop across the road and get a coffee. So she takes the money over to get a coffee and gives it to them. They put it in the till, and then they're like, oh, it's a bit of a slow day, I'll go and get my hair cut. So then they go to the barber's and they get their hair cut. And the barber's like, oh, it's my mum's birthday tomorrow and I forgot to send her a card, I better go and get some stamps. So they whiz over to the post office with the money. There's blue hands all over the place. And then the post office, they give it to someone through their pension, and then they go off to the shops, and it goes round and round and round. And they worked out that your £1 becomes worth, let me get this right, £1.76 if you spend it locally to the local economy. So it magnifies its effect. And in fact, they've used this thinking to start influencing how local authorities spend their money. Because if they only use suppliers who are cheap because they're based in London or whatever, that money leaves the local economy. Whereas if they pay maybe a wee bit more and use local suppliers, then that money starts fueling the local economy and enriching the entire community. So that's a very stark example. In Cape Cod, I was once in a church there, and they had a little thing in the pews, which was their sort of Lent project, which was they wanted you to think of 3 local businesses you didn't want to see fail. It might be the hairdressers or the florist or the pub or whatever. And they wanted you to commit to spending $50 in them. And it was about just picking places that you wanted to patronize, that you wanted proactively to vote for. Because again, when I used to sing in the church choir off the King's Road, and you'd go down the King's Road and you'd see this beautiful flower stall. all the bouquets of flowers, you know, £30 or whatever, because we're talking Chelsea, aren't we? So you'd use that as your cue to think, oh, I must get some flowers. And then you would cross the road to go into Waitrose, still expensive, we're Chelsea, to get cheaper flowers there. But again, the more you do that, then no one goes to the flower stall, and it goes. And then there's no flower stall anymore. And we've seen that happen all over the high street, haven't we? So there's something about use it or lose it with your bank statement. You know, are there places that even if you don't drink, you know, going to your local pub and having a coffee and doing the crossword might keep it in business, which might be really important for your community. So having a think about the kind of spin-off effects and the longer term effects of where your money goes when you send it into this economy would, I think, be really helpful. I've been banging on, so I'm going to stop there for you to have a wee break and a coffee. And I'm going to catch up on all these questions in the chat so that we can come back and have a proper conversation. But while you're putting the kettle on, have a think about what I've said, what I haven't said, where you want me to go next, what questions you've got. And then let's come back and have a chat about that. Any notices before we send everyone off for tea? Anything that needs to be said?
Just to say, sorry, just to say first, thank you.